Hey guys, welcome to my Garuda guide. Now the reason I'm calling this a guide and not a build is because I'm not going to focus on any one particular build. Instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a specific setup that I came up with Garuda that makes her insanely versatile and you can build her pretty much however you want, but it changes her gameplay entirely. It makes her a completely different type of Warframe to play. It completely streamlines her kit. And it basically, I'll get into all of the advantages later. But first and foremost, I'll talk a little bit about her kit. What Garuda does is she has her first ability, which I'm not going to talk about right now. She has her fourth ability, which I'm not going to talk about right now. But she has her third ability that essentially drains half her health to regenerate 25% of her maximum energy back. And she has her second ability, which creates a healing beacon. It turns an enemy into a healing beacon, so you'll need an enemy around you for it. And that healing beacon is going to stay there for a certain length of time, and it's going to heal you a certain amount of health over time to heal yourself back, so you could keep using your third ability and keep regenerating your energy, so you could keep using your first and fourth abilities. But the way most people build her, if they would want to subsume a Helminth ability onto her, they would either replace her first or fourth abilities, depending on which one they feel more comfortable giving up. The reason I say that this build completely changes her gameplay is because we're not going to do that. Essentially, we're going to opt into doing something way more efficient and just flat out better instead. And I'm going to probably argue that this is the best way to build Garuda, and if you replace anything but her second ability, you are crazy. So, let me get into it a little bit more in depth. Now, I have 6 different profiles for Garuda, configs for Garuda, sorry, and each of these, if you're going to notice, I'm replacing her second ability. Now, again, like I said, I'm not going to get into depth about any of these in particular, but if you keep in mind that Garuda Streamlined can have infinite energy, non-stop energy regeneration, that means non-stop spamming of Helminth abilities that you subsume onto her, and that is again why I'm not even going into her first and fourth abilities, because these are insane. I'm going to talk about them in the gameplay that I'm going to show later, but her ability to regenerate as much energy as she wants allows her to spam Helminth abilities. So we could spam Thermal Sunder and make her into a nuke. We could spam Nourish, which isn't very useful, but this is a pretty good build though. We could spam Breach Surge, which is going to proc lots of Breach Surge sparks onto enemies and help deal with large groups of them. You could subsume Infested Mobility. This is, again, not something that you could really spam because you can't recast it, but it does help when you're doing exterminate missions with Garuda, and you just want something to help you get through the level fast. I use this config for running exterminate missions. Pillage, again, if you spam Pillage, then you could afford to have less than optimal armor strip, because you could just keep spamming the ability all the time, and additionally this also regenerates shields. And this is basically a CC, not entirely spammable, but somewhat spammable ability that weakens enemies towards her first and fourth abilities, and also stuns enemies for a very, very long time. I use this for defense and mobile defense missions. Now, am I crazy? How could I replace her second ability? Then how am I going to get my health back after using Bloodletting? Well, that's where Molt Reconstruct comes in. And I'm going to argue that this is just a flat-out improvement on every single possible aspect of her second ability, therefore making her second ability obsolete. Now, this heals allies within affinity range, where the range of her second ability is far more limited. This doesn't require an enemy to be present, and it's spammable. It doesn't take any energy to heal yourself because it heals yourself as a side effect of casting your other abilities, and that is where the quality of life of this setup comes into play. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Bloodletting Then any of our other abilities that we cast is going to heal us back to full, allowing us to, again, spam Bloodletting, another ability, Bloodletting, 2 or 3 other abilities, Bloodletting, another ability, Bloodletting, 2 or 3 other abilities. You get where I'm going with this. So the only caveat for this is that Garuda with base 300 health is very weak. This isn't just relating to my setup, it's in general. So I would recommend either on setups that you're subsuming a Helminth ability that has heat procs, I would recommend finding a way to put on Archon Vitality. This would double the heat procs, essentially somewhat doubling the damage of those abilities. And then you will be able to put Molt Augmented to kind of increase the damage of your abilities and gain more ability strength over time. But in cases where you're not using this, you could save yourself a mod slot and instead opt for what I'm doing, for instance, in my Nourish build, where I'm going with Molt Reconstruct and Arcane Blessing, which is going to turn us into tanks in addition to everything else, because we're going to end up with 1.5 or 1.8 thousand health, which, again, like I said, we're getting most of back by just casting each ability once, especially the more expensive ones like Seeking Talents. So this also turns her into an aerial bomber, like I've been saying earlier. So just to recap, Arcane Blessing for more max health to allow her to somewhat cope with taking damage, because 300 health is not much. Her first ability helps her be a little bit more tanky because it mitigates all damage coming from a certain direction, stretching out what this 300 is worth a little bit more. But with Arcane Blessing, you're going to end up being tanky as a mission progresses, and it's very useful. So, let me basically show the gameplay for this, and what I mean by an aerial bomber. So we're using my Nourish build, which means I'm going to be losing health when enemies die, meaning at first I'm going to have to be careful until I start stacking a little bit higher max health. But this is what I mean by an aerial bomber. Infinite airtime. I can even gain height. I'm staying completely immune to damage for the most part. Yeah, forget about my pet for a second. Yeah, this is the gameplay. I'm already at 400 and something health. With this build, since I'm using shield regen based on ability casting, so just casting my abilities, I get health back, I get shields back, I can stay in the air forever, I can heal myself back from the health I lose from Nourish. Nourish applies viral procs on enemies, making them take more damage from my fourth ability. You get the point. Now, that is just to showcase the aerial bomber feature of this, but also just to show you that it's Steel Path viable, and what I mean by having almost 100% uptime on invulnerability. Keep an eye on my health and what's going on there. It is only very briefly that I'm even targetable. The fourth ability has 2 different modes. One of them is, if you use the augment, it has 2 different modes. One of them is tapping, one of them is holding. But even if you don't have the augment, you could still cast fast. by holding and then releasing halfway, it shortens the distance, but it casts immediately. So if you don't have 3 Archon Shards Honor, that would be a good way to keep the invulnerability going, like I'm doing right now. I haven't even fired a bullet yet. And that was just to showcase what I mean by an aerial bomber. Now imagine that instead of Nourish, I actually had something like Thermal Sunder, or any other Helminth ability that you want, and then just replace Nourish with that, and the gameplay is exactly the same. You're gonna basically be carpet bombing everything from the air. You're going to be basically a better Styanax. Keep in mind, you can gain height infinitely the way you gain height is by holding aim glide. When you aim glide, you're actually able to sustain your height and even gain height when you cast your 4th ability. Yep, that's essentially the build. Have a nice day, guys.